paper by Éamonn or Ciardha. We just checked whether we pronounce the last name correctly, because it's always a bit difficult for us to pronounce Irish words. My name is Maria Eisenmann. I'm head of the TEFL chair, just for those who haven't met me before. And I'm also co-founder of the Irish Studies here in Würzburg, together with Anna Bergman from the American department. And we regularly have guest lectures here, as you might know, or have seen on our website. And I'm very, very happy that we could get Éamonn to us to speak to you today about a very well popular series, actually, which has been very popular in the 90s. So it's more like for our age group, but I think it's also good for you to know about that and compare it to make it connected to our today's lives. So thank you very much for being here, and I'll pass on the word to Jennifer Meyer, who has this course.
So I'm really happy that all of you came today and that we have a few more faces we have to see maybe. So I will say just a few words to our guest today, to Éamonn. Or maybe you pronounce your name.
Yeah, Éamonn, that's grand.
Perfect. So he's from Ulster University, and at the moment he's a visiting professor at the University of Saarland. And he's come here to visit us. So he's a reader in history and Irish at Ulster University. And he taught at several prestigious institutions, like in Toronto, you just told us about, you were in Toronto, and and in Saarbrücken a few years back, you were at the University of Notre Dame, at Trinity College in Dublin, and so on. And your research focus lies on Irish Jacobitism, on Irish outlaws and military history, on Irish popular politics, culture, language, and literature, and of course on Irish book history. You can see on our website on Irish Studies all of his publications and his works, and I'm really looking forward to your lecture now. And
thank you so much, and it's a real honour for me to be here. I am a native of County Monaghan, which is a small county on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and I live about 25 miles away from the birthplace of St. Killian, who brought Christianity to this region, and whose the glosses, the annotations on the great religious manuscripts that are held in this city's archives contain the oldest Irish poetry that has ever been written down. So it's a great honour for me to be here. As Jennifer said, I'm an early modern historian. I work mainly on early modern cultural history. So in a sense, for me, this is a bit of a This is last week's paper for the type of work that I do. But I thought, because I grew up in what was a staunchly Catholic country. When I was a teenager, or when I was a young boy, 85% of Irish people attended Mass every Sunday. And in the period immediately before this comedy show aired on Channel 4, UK TV station, the Catholic Church and attendance at Catholic services had collapsed as a consequence of a whole series of scandals, including the mistreatment of single mothers, unmarried mothers, and also a scourge of paedophilia in the Catholic Church that was particularly bad in Ireland, but it affected most countries across the world. So in a sense, I grew up in this period of rapid change. So I'm moving out of my comfort zone, and I'm going to be talking about this, but I'm also going to be talking about myself, not because I'm an egomaniac or a narcissist, but my own experience does shed light on this period of cataclysmic change. I am an unashamed Luddite, so I tend not to use PowerPoint, and I tend to work from paper and speak too much with my hands. You will already have noticed, but hopefully I can pepper this presentation with a couple of short snippets from this series, and also from issues on, little videos of things relating to the Catholic Church. But I suppose if you're to fit you can fit Father Ted as an unashamedly Irish comedy, right? It was broadcast in the UK, but it's very Irish in that most of the major actors were either stand-up comedians, you know, very well-regarded theatre actors, you know, who tread the boards at the Abbey Theatre or the Gaiety Theatre in Dublin. So a really good comedy script and really quality actors, but it also fits in a, well, let's see, yeah.
You can use the arrows if you want on the...
Right, I got it. Yeah, so it fits into a glorious tradition of English/British comedy. You know, I'm not going to go through all of these. I'll pick some of them. Till Death Do Us Part, for example, catalogued the family life of an unashamed West Ham supporter and small-minded English racist called Alf Garnett. Of course, Alf Garnett was, and I forget what the name of the actor. He was a Jewish man from East London, and he was totally unlike, naturally enough, the character that he played. But he was so good that people would meet him in the street and they'd praise him for his small-minded Little England racist opinions. Dad's Army, again, this was a show set during the Second World War. It was made in the 1970s, and it followed the misadventures of the trials, tribulations, misadventures of the English Home Guard, who were there to protect England from, you know, from the Third Reich, from the Nazi hordes. And of course, it was comedy. You know, they were incompetent. You know, it was the small-minded, parochial, you know, petty bourgeois sort of, you know, for example, Captain Mannering, who's the banker. Of course, because he's the banker and he's important, he takes over. He's the commander of this, and there's all these other hilarious characters. There's a Scotsman, there's a sort of Lothario, sort of public school educated sergeant, and he's always trying to humour his boss, who's also his boss in the bank, as well as his commanding officer. Yes, Minister, again, a fantastic show. It started its life as Yes, Minister, then it became Yes, Prime Minister, and it essentially follows the political career of James Hacker, who's the Minister for Executive Affairs, and then he comes of Administrative Affairs, then he becomes the Prime Minister, and the head of the civil service, Sir Humphrey Appleby. And again, these three actors, you know, and Paul Eddington, Nigel Hawthorne, and Derek Fones, fantastic show, played in front of a live studio audience. And you actually watch it now, and you can watch it now after Brexit, and you can see, in a sense, how, and some of the clips are often used to parody Brexit. Blackadder, again, Blackadder was a show. There's a medieval series of episodes, an early modern centred around Queen Elizabeth I. Then there's the Regency under George III and George IV, and then there's one centred on the First World War. This was written by Ben Elton, and actually Ben Elton's uncle was Regius Professor of History in Cambridge. Elton himself studied history in Cambridge, and it's so good that, like, if I was teaching when I'm teaching early modern history, I would often show clips from it. And again, you can go down through Oviders in Pet, again, follows the careers of a Londoner, a Scouser, or a Liverpudlian. somebody from a West Country and two Geordies who come to Germany in the 1970s, late 70s, early 80s to work. They have their own prejudices, Little England, we won the war, and how this plays out in reality. It's poignant, but it's also incredibly funny because they realise that the German guys on the building sites are in the same boat as them. And you can keep going. This is sort of chronological order. You'll get episodes of most of them on YouTube, and they're well worth dipping into. The English have, we criticise the English for a lot of things, but they have a mastery of this type of sitcom. I did compare Father Ted to Fawlty Towers for a couple of reasons. Fawlty Towers was voted by English TV audiences as the most popular comedy show ever, and Father Ted came in second. Fawlty Towers follows the slapstick, haphazard career of Basil Fawlty, who owns a hotel in Torquay, which he likes to portray as the English Riviera. Again, but John Cleese, the tall man with the moustache, was one of the founding figures in the Monty Python Flying Circus, The Life of Brian, The Holy Grail, and his wife, or his ex-wife, his then wife, the lady on the right, Connie Booth, was an American comedian who co-wrote the script. His wife, the sort of his formidable wife, Sybil, again a very famous, well-regarded English actor, and then their Spanish waiter who didn't speak much English. Obviously, he was a very well-respected English actor. And again, what this show tries to do is it speaks to England, post-war England, and its endeavour or its struggle to find a place in the world. It's got the snobbery, the racism, the parochialism, and it has that thing that many English comedy shows have. You'll sit watching it and you're embarrassed for, and I'm going to show you a clip, if I can, of when, and he stereotypes, there's various people like, there's an old major who's a resident in the hotel. There's two old ladies who are very sort of middle-class, polite old English ladies. And of course, he treats them abominably. There's an Irish builder who's a sort of he's a bit hooky. He always does a cheap, often substandard job. Fawlty really likes him. The wife's deeply suspicious. There's the suave French chef who keeps the place running until he leaves, and then everything falls apart. The working class English chef who dates the waitress, he despises them. And then you have the Australian Lothario. He arrives, he's smuggling young women into his hotel. Then you have the American who comes and he's asking for various exotic cocktails, and the American expresses a level of service. And then, of course, you have the Germans. And the Germans arrive, and Fawlty has just had an accident. So the context here is Fawlty has concussion. He hops his head. These Germans arrive, and he's desperately trying to make them feel comfortable. But of course, he puts his foot in it. His mantra to his staff is "Don't mention the war," and of course, he can't open his mouth without mentioning the war. He's desperately trying hard, but he hasn't, in a sense. He hasn't managed to, he has a punch on. But there's a dearth of this type of comedy sitcom in Ireland for a couple of reasons, a couple of key reasons. One, Ireland's a small country. At this you know, in the 1980s, the population of the Republic of Ireland was probably 4.5 million, 1 million in Northern Ireland, and there was only 3 TV stations between the two of them. Secondly, I suppose Irish comedy is probably best manifest in print literature, in the works of, you know, people like Flann O'Brien, and indeed Flann O'Brien, the author of Unbailed Buck, The Poor Mouth, the Dalkey Archive, also wrote a fantastic weekly comedy piece in the Irish press called On Cruiskeen Lawn, or The Full Jug, and people who didn't buy the Irish press because of their political prejudices would nevertheless buy it on a Friday to read his article. A lot of political satire. So Ireland's a small country, small population, you know, 2 TV stations, and another crucial, if you like, strain of Irish comedy is stand-up. Obviously, the British, the English, and the Scottish are known across the world for stand-up. Probably stand-up comedy is something that was probably much more popular in Ireland. And I think the third and fourth reasons is that, you know, Ireland at this period, it's a first world country with a second world economy. Like, our economy in the 1970s and 80s was probably more comparable to an Eastern European economy, that maybe Poland or certainly in the 70s, Poland or Hungary, than it was to the UK or the United States. And thirdly, if Ireland's a first world economy, first world country, second world economy, it most definitely has a third world memory, because Ireland had been colonised, it had won its independence in the 1920s, and for a whole series of reasons, that dream had died, or at least it was ailing. So I'm old enough to remember turning on the television and there'd be some English comedian sending up the Irish for being stupid. At the same time, of course, they were sending up black people and Indians and Pakistanis. My parents did not want to watch that. They didn't think it funny, and that would be turned off. And so a lot of our comedy was stand-up. Also in the theatre, people like Jimmy O'Dea, Maureen Potter, Éamonn Morrissey, Éamonn Kelly, this was where the comedy trade was played. And actually, this man here, who's the Father Ted, who's the hero in this show, he had played various characters who would make cameo appearances, like Father Trendy. And Father Trendy was a young priest who wore a shiny black suit, and he was parodying a priest from my own diocese called Father Brian Darcy, who understood that the church had to modernise and reach out to younger people. Dermot Morgan also had a brilliant comedy satirical show called Scrap Saturday. And on a Saturday morning, farmers would leave their fields, they would drive their tractors home to listen to this on the radio. And it was biting political satire. He sent up mainly the Irish Prime Minister, Charles Haughey. And Haughey at the time, and I'll never forget watching it on the television, he sat down in front of the people, his people, and he had a £1,300 Ciardha French linen short on him, and he was telling us that we needed to tighten our belts. So he had this show. It was based on The Godfather, you know, the film about the Don Corleone, and he was Don Charleone, and then he had his minions, you know, his consiglieres, his fixers. And that show was so popular, and Haughey hated it so much that he actually intervened to get it off the radio, off RTE. Dermot Morgan ended up going to England, playing a straight as a comedian there, and ultimately Graham Lenihan and I forget who and Arthur Matthews offered this show. And this show was based on the lives of 3 priests. Father Ted, gay in the middle, and Ted has been banished to this island because he had his fingers caught in the till, as we would say at home. He was misusing parish funds. He went to Las Vegas and he used money that should have been used to send a child to Lourdes. Then you have this man here, Ardal O'Hanlon, who's also a stand-up comedian from my own County Monaghan, and he plays his sidekick, the curate, who's a complete idiot. And then Father Jack is this, he's basically a drunk. He'd sit guzzling bottles of Jack Daniels, domestos, toilet cleaner, and all he says is feck and girls. So he's basically a drunk. And then the person who keeps the house together is the housekeeper, Mrs. Doyle. And Mrs. Doyle's catchphrase is, "Will you have a cup of tea?" And like my late mother-in-law, God rest her soul, is English. And if I come to the house, she'd say, "Would you like a cup of tea?" And I'd say, "No, you're grand." Go on. So this became, and of course they watched and enjoyed this show. My mother, who would be a devout Catholic, my mother initially hated it, but it grew on her, and then she would watch it. But again, it was a comedy, unashamedly hilarious comedy show. But it had, there was more to it than comedy. So these 3 men are on essentially a desert island on Arranmore off the west coast of Ireland, and Bishop Leonard Brennan, the bishop, is like a tyrant, and they're terrified of him. He'll arrive with his robes, and he's a snob. He's also got a mistress. He holidays in California. So, and of course, that character is based on a bishop that we'll be talking about later. So it does. While it's a comedy, it does highlight, the loneliness, the issues that, these men had living a celibate life, and in their case, on an island. And then you have all these other characters who appear, that we talk about. Again, I've a lot of these. There's video clips which I'll talk about, but I want to draw your attention to this film, The Rocky Road to Dublin. That film was made in the 1950s. You can get it online, and if you want to understand the Catholic Church prior to Father Ted and prior to its essentially political and cultural suicide in the early 90s around the paedophile scandals and the Magdalene laundries, etc. Watch that film, because as Joyce famously said about Ireland, "Oh, Ireland, my love, where Caesar and Christ go hand in glove." After 700 years, the Irish managed to loosen Caesar's grip on the island, or at least on part of it, but they rushed headlong into the arms of Christ, into the arms of Mother Church. And that film encapsulates this very well. I mentioned Father Trendy, and you can watch his attempts to be cool, his attempts to reach out to the youth. I suppose in 1979, this is, if you like, the heady days of this type of popular Catholicism. He was then Pope John Paul II, made a decision to visit Ireland in 1979. 1.1 million people crowded into the Phoenix Park in Dublin to hear Mass. And he went, he also spoke, he gave a youth Mass in Galway. And again, if you watch this clip here of Mlanton and Galway, and the crowd is being entertained by 2 men, the singing priest, Father Michael Cleary, and certainly the most high-profile, most popular bishop, Éamonn. It transpired later that Michael Cleary was living with his housekeeper. He had so his housekeeper was his mistress. He had 2 children with her, and at the same time, when his housekeeper got pregnant, Bishop Casey, his friend, advised him to bring her to England to have an abortion. And the importance of this, and obviously this is not an anti-Catholic rant, as I seldom quote Elizabeth I of England, but I've no wish to make windows into men's or women's souls. But it was the hypocrisy of this. These were 2 men who, they tried to be popular, to reach out, but they were dogmatic on the issues of, artificial contraception, sex before marriage, divorce, abortion, despite the fact that they were living in sin. And they were telling people like me how I should behave, with the opposite sex, while they, as celibate men who had taken religious vows, they weren't exactly practicing what they preached. And there is, again, this is a great, there's an interview here with Annie Murphy, who was I think a distant relation, maybe a 2nd or 3rd cousin of Bishop Casey, but they had an affair, they had a child, and the interview on the Late Late Show between this woman, and she's interviewed by, at that time, the godfather of Irish television, Gay Bourne. It's a telling insight into the hypocrisy and how ultimately this fallen American woman was ultimately blamed for leading this man of the cloth astray. It subsequently transpired after Bishop Casey's death that not only had he a child out of wedlock, which I'm not passing judgment on, but he was also abusing his own niece. So in a sense, this was ultimately, this was the period before the collapse. And this was a monumental collapse. In the 1970s, church attendance was probably 85%, which would have been twice as high as it was in France or Italy or any other Catholic country. By the middle of the 1990s, that had collapsed, and it has continued to dwindle. Now I'm going to talk about myself and my own experiences and the priests and religious in my own life. When my father was a boy, John Charles McQuaid was Archbishop of Dublin. He was born in County Cavan, not that far from where I was born, the son of a draper. By the time he had climbed to the top of the greasy pole of the Irish Catholic Church, he saw himself like Cardinal Richelieu. Every meeting that took place in Dublin, whether it was the Irish Country Women's Association, the Communist Party of Ireland, somebody would be at that meeting reporting back to him. He knew who every politician in Leinster House who was having an affair, and he knew who their mistress was. At that time, Bishop Eugene O'Callaghan was the Bishop of Clogher, of my diocese. So when my father was a teenager, my father didn't drink till he was 21, but at that time, he is a small farm straddling 2 dioceses, the Diocese of Kilmore and the Diocese of Clogher. The Diocese of Kilmore is where St. Killian hailed from. And this bishop made drinking moonshine or poaching a reserved sin. So if you drank poaching or illicit whiskey, you couldn't go to the priest for absolution, you had to go to him. And he was like a lion. So, I talked to many men who made that pilgrimage to the palace in Monaghan to get absolution for drinking poaching, and it was not a pleasant experience. But of course, many Irish men and women, women tend, I don't want to be sexist or stereotype, but women tended to, they would be more heavily involved in preparing children for Holy Communion, confirmation, etc. So men tended not to they'd go to mass every Sunday, but they didn't always take the sacrament, but they would always perform what was known as the Easter duty. You'd go to confessions and you'd have communion at Easter. And growing up myself, these were the 5 priests that I dealt with, and in many ways there were 5 men that I admired. They were without question, they were honourable men, they were good men. There was never any scandal or abuse associated with their names. Father Maguire was essentially a penal priest of the 17th or 18th century. He had no interest whatsoever in material wealth. His clothes would be threadbare. He drove an old car. All he was interested in was religion. And he'd come into the school with a suitcase full of holy books and he'd hand them out to us. And also when we were kids, if you were hitchhiking out of the town, when you'd see his car coming, you'd jump across the hedge or you'd hide, not because you wouldn't be comfortable in the car, but as soon as he'd get you into the car, he would start saying the rosary. And you couldn't get out of the car until he had finished the rosary, so it would actually be quicker to walk than to sit with him. But we all liked him, he was a good man. Then Father McCluskey arrived. He was younger man, and Father McCluskey, God rest, both of them are dead. Father McCluskey could have run any small business. He was a genius with money. When he arrived, the parish was in chaos. The church was falling down. He organised fundraising drives, raffles, and he put it back in rude health. Similarly, Father Jordan. Father Jordan was a close friend of my sister and her husband. They were a young married couple, and he cheerlead her, he went to their house, he would drink tea, maybe have dinner with them. So he had a great sort of rapport with younger parishioners, but a lot of the older parishioners didn't necessarily. There was a bit of jealousy, but it was also the fact that, he was a man of the cloth he shouldn't be doing. Father McHugh was a friend of mine. He was a great man. He died recently, he died young. And he taught me English in St. Pacart's College. He also trained the football team. He was a hard man. I often suffered. I often got 10 of the best with a strap or a cane. This was when corporal punishment was still legal. But I remember Father McHugh, and we would talk about various things, politics and religion. And he was a suave, he was a handsome man. He always reminded me of the priest in the Thorn Boards, Father Ralph. He was handsome. And without being sexist or anything, you could see that the school we were in, the female teachers would gravitate towards him because he was polite, he was handsome, he was a perfect gentleman. But he took his vocation very seriously. He wouldn't have contravened that. But I remember talking to him, and for me it was profoundly sad. I remember talking to him about the paedophile scandals of the early 90s. And of course, this hurt him deeply. And he said to me, he says, Éamonn, he says, at the end of the day, what happened here was awful, and the abuse of children. And he says, and what it touched me personally, he says, because I'm an uncle. And he says, the most natural thing in the world when we go to a restaurant, my niece or my nephew would sit up on my knee. I have to push them away. And I was at his funeral, and I saw them, same nieces and nephews that were in their 20s, crying their eyes out at his passing. So these were men, he was a man that ultimately, and I suppose the terrible thing, the paedophile scandals and the abuse of single women and unmarried mothers in the Catholic Church, obviously the real victims there were the children and the women. But another often forgotten group of victims was the nuns, the priests, and the clergy and religious who dedicated their lives to teaching, to working in old people's homes, maternity homes, etc. And in a sense, it was a betrayal of them too, and they're often forgotten. I myself am not a religious man, but I did go to a Catholic school. It was a boarding school, and on the whole, I had a positive experience. Now this was the 1980s when you could get caned, and I got some good beatings when I was there. But the lay teachers for me were worse than the priests. It was a good school. I got a good education. There was a great emphasis on religion, sport, and corporal punishment, not necessarily in that order. But you know, I came from a relatively modest background. My father was a small farmer, and his people going back to before the famine were small farmers. There was never a priest or a nun in my family because we were poor. You know, poor people went to America or they went to England. You had to have money. You had to have wealth to put a son into Maynooth or put a daughter into the convent. But I have to say, I had a great experience there. And you know, last year, my closest friend from college died in a tragic accident. And his father was the gynecologist, the consultant gynecologist in the hospital in Monaghan Town. And I have to say, obviously, my father, when we'd be picked up at the weekend to be taken home, my father, I would come up in a piece of junk car and I would be embarrassed. His father would come up in like a really fancy motor. But I have to say that I was treated exactly the same as, and I have to say, and I've talked to many of my former schoolmates about that. On the whole, it was a positive experience. So while I can see, ultimately, St. Patrick came to Ireland in 432 to minister to Christians already there. St. Patrick didn't convert the Irish to Christianity, and he didn't banish the snakes. I hope I didn't ruin, you know, burst any of your bubbles. But for the most part, because of our distance from Rome, because of, in the aftermath of the Reformation, because the Catholic Church was more concerned with survival than reform, the Irish Church was a Celtic church based around monasticism, you know, the rule of the Dominicans and the Franciscans, later the Jesuits. It was a local focused worship around holy wells, local saints, you know, patterns, you know, people would have mass in their houses as opposed, because there were no churches. But really, the famine, after the famine, Rome stamped its authority on Irish Catholicism. Catholicism became more hierarchical. The activity switched from the house and the holy well into these fantastic Baroque churches, and the pattern was replaced by Benediction, First Friday, Holy Saturday. So, and that in a sense, that devotional revolution, as it's called, was imposed upon a traumatized people. And that church survived in various ways right up until the 1990s. I did introduce political satire. Again, you know, Hall's Pictorial Weekly, Scrap Saturday. These were the type of shows that Irish people talked in the 70s. Moving on, again, I'm not going to open these, but they're little clips of the characters in Father Ted. And you have the key figures, Mrs. Doyle, Father Ted, Father Dougal, Father Jack. But then you have all these other characters. There's another island. They're on Craggy Island. There's another island called Rugged Island. And Dick Bourne and Dick's a sort of a suave Lothario type, but he's been banished as well. And he has he's a drunken sidekick and a stupid sidekick like Ted, and there's always rivalry between them. And this rivalry manifests itself in how they keep the Lenten observance. There will be talent competitions where, you know, or singing competitions. So there's then Dick has this accident-prone friend called Larry Duff, and he always rings him when he's skiing in the Alps or when he's after being stopped at a checkpoint. Father Damo then is this young priest come down from Dublin, and he's too cool for school. He has an earring, and he's an Oasis fan, and Dougal reveres him, and he gets an earring, and ultimately Father Damon gets him in trouble. Then there's the Father Finton Stack character. Then he's just this horrible man who moves in and makes their lives a misery. Father Hernandez is a Cuban, cigar-smoking, Porsche driving Lothario, and he's always talking about women, and he's a friend of Dougal or Ted, but he sort of makes them feel uncomfortable. Then there's the Nats, there's a few others, the Nazi priest. There's this priest lives on another island, and he collects World War II memorabilia, and he tells Ted about his collection. Ted thinks, this is great, I'll go and see it. But it turns out that Ted goes there, it's swastikas, it's like the last knife that was used by the Fuhrer. And Ted says, have you any stuff from the Allies? And he says, no, I wouldn't be interested in that kind of thing at all. So he dies, and he bequeaths his Nazi collection to Ted. At the same time as Ted is, number one, trying to reach out to a small Chinese community on the island, and he's also refurbishing the house. So all the Nazi memorabilia comes to the house. Mrs. Doyle puts it up, and he invites the Chinese for tea, and all hell ensues. And then, of course, you have the housekeeper, Mrs. Doyle, the nuns. And there's always a bit of rivalry between nuns and priests. Father Jack hates nuns. Then Sister Assumpta comes, and she's basically a masochist. And they want her to help them to keep Lent. And she arrives with a whip. She beats them, she ties them up, she stuffs her face with food and chocolate, and she gives them water soup. Then there's the feminist Sinead O'Connor character who arrives. And first of all, they don't know how to deal with women, except Mrs. Doyle. And Mrs. Doyle's not a woman, she's a housekeeper, right? So when this Sinead O'Connor character arrives, and she's brash, she's Sinead O'Connor, and all hell breaks loose. All of these things, not only is the Catholic Church sent up in a hilarious and often brutal way, but various other shibboleths of Irish life, the Irish television, it's a small country on the periphery of Europe, but RTE presenters think they try to compare themselves to contemporary British or American, and it's always hilarious. Then we have this really bizarre, I don't know what you call it, a beauty pageant or talent contest called the Rose of Tralee. And it's been running for 70 or 80 years. And basically what it is it's a tourist, it's more to try and attract people, tourists to Ireland. So every Irish county and all areas of the Irish diaspora will pick a young woman and send her to this rather bizarre competition as to who becomes the Rose of Tralee. I taught in Vienna a few years, and there was a lovely French PhD student there. And we were chatting about something, and she says, I was the Rose of Tralee for, it was Alsace-Lorraine or whatever. And she seemed like the most unlikely person. But she said to me, I had the best crack, and we would say crack as opposed to fun. She said it was a hoot. She didn't take it too serious, but they send up this, and It's called the Lovely Girls competition. So basically, it's there's competitions how to make sandwiches properly and how to cut the triangles, how to use a broom. So it's all this kind of sexist things that a lovely girl is supposed to do, and it's quite funny. The Eurovision, of course, for years. I never had much interest in the Eurovision, but you'd always watch the voting and you didn't care who won as long as we beat England, which was a bit silly, but we were teenagers. But we had this theory that the Europeans used to let us win just because we couldn't afford to host it, right? Because Ireland was poor. So they basically we let Ireland win for the crack. But again, this is sent up and there's Ireland desperately doesn't want to win the Eurovision, so they open it as a competition, and Ted and Dougal enter with a song called My Lovely Horse, right? And they steal, there's a Norwegian song that came last, and the B-side of their record, they steal it, the tune, and they find out that everybody who had sang it, who had produced it, who had wrote it, were killed in a plane crash, so they figure we'll get away with this. Then, when they're about to go on stage, he goes for a cigarette, Ted goes for a cigarette, and he meets a guy whistling the tune. Then he's in the elevator, and it's been piped out, so of course they have to improvise, and it's a disaster. While his colleague or his rival Dick Byrne does this fantastic song, and he is an orchestra and it's fabulous, but Ted wins because Ireland doesn't want to win it, so they want to send the worst show that they have, or the worst act that they have. The Troubles, naturally enough, this is the early 90s, in the sort of end game of the Troubles in the years before the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. So the Troubles are a bit raw, so they stay, and they do, in fairness, they stay away, naturally enough, from paedophile. It's a comedy show. The bishop has a mistress, and they leave it at that. But at the same time, they nevertheless, and like Fawlty Towers, if I say to my English wife, don't mention the war, she knows exactly. It's like, no, don't talk about that. Or if I say, we'll go to a nice restaurant, I'll say, I like this place, no riffraff, because Fawlty organised a gourmet evening and he put up, and of course it was a disaster. The chef got drunk and the food was late. It was just a disaster. But he put up gourmet evening, no riffraff, the English Riviera. And this is the same. Ted was caught basically with his hand on the till. And when anybody brings up his financial improprieties, he always says, the money was just resting in my account. So if my wife says to me, we need this or we need that, or I'll say, no problem, the money's resting in my account. And of course, similarly, go on the tea. The lights are on, but there's nobody home. That's something that, because Dougal was stupid, if Dougal would be talking about the bishop's mistress, and when the bishop had arrived, he'd say, don't mention the son. And of course, Dougal would say, how is your son? And then Ted would have to say, the Son of God, he'd have to try and recover things. But Dougal would always assure Ted, don't worry, the lights are on, but nobody's home, as in I'm stupid. You would be the brains of the operation. That's something that Irish people say. If you arrive, say, at a building site, my friend's a builder. If I arrive at a building site and they're starting to do something, I'd come in and say, okay, so who's the brains of the operation here? As in, things are not going very well. I'd just be kidding them, obviously. And then the Protestants, up to no good as usual, because, Ted it was something to do with, ecumenicalism and Ted, that was Ted's catchphrase, the Protestants up to no good as usual. And if you happen to be in Ireland in the summertime and you have a mind to, if you discover Father Ted, you can go to the Ted Fest, which takes place on the craggy island. I had a very funny experience of this. I was driving somewhere, and whether somebody rang me or something, and I had to pull into a car park. And I pulled into the car park, and there was a van, right? And there were 15 or 20 women in various levels of intoxication and various levels of undress. So they were pulling nuns' habits over them because they were dressing up in nuns to go off to the island. Then you'd meet a guy with a priest with a, spangled green, or really shiny jacket. Then people would dress up as the bishop. There's a lovely girls' competition, of course, and you'd have to come up on the stage and show how good your mopping was, it's a bit of fun, and thousands of people go to it every year. I think COVID might have dealt it a blow, but I suppose, like many festivals, it's a bit of harmless fun. The show itself ran for 25 episodes. When the last episode had just finished, Dermot Morgan, the hero, suffered a massive heart attack. He was only 49 years old. He died. And in dying, Ireland lost a great stand-up comedian and somebody who tickled not only the Irish nation's funny bone, but he propelled this show to the top, if you like, of UK TV ratings. It's a funny show, and if you have a chance to watch it, you'll hopefully enjoy it. But it also is a snapshot of the cataclysmic change that took place in Ireland at the end of the 1980s, the beginning of the 1990s. I'll leave it at that. Thank you for your time and attention, and needless to say, I'll be happy to answer any questions or try to answer any questions that you might have.
So thank you so much for the insight and your really, really funny intakes. So are there any questions, anything you'd like to add or ask?
What about the church in Ireland? Did they take offence, or did they?
I imagine some elderly clerics might have taken offence, but I suppose I'll answer that question with an anecdote, right? My friend in college, his uncle was a priest, right? And when the Life of Brian, Monty Python's Life of Brian, and it was banned in every, when it came out. But obviously, over time, people realised that, it wasn't blasphemous. It was what we would say in Ireland, it was a piss take. It was a bit of fun. And it was, in a sense, there was also a lesson in there about hysteria and, having your own opinions, following a lead or whatever. But I was talking to my friend's uncle, and there was one cinema. He loved the film, by the way, but there was one cinema in England that had continued, that had either banned it, and they finally lifted the ban, and he said to me, like, it's nothing sacred. Like, obviously he was only kidding, because in a sense, there's if you want to understand the Life of Brian, there's a fantastic interview with Malcolm Muggeridge and the Bishop of Salisbury and John Cleese and Michael Palin, and the two guys, Palin and John Cleese, take the two other guys apart, because it's not about, it's not about blasphemy, it's about another guy who people take as their Messiah. So yeah, I imagine for some it was hard. But for others, it was probably cathartic too. You know what I mean? Because an organisation like the Catholic Church that wielded such power, they themselves knew, that there had to be change, and obviously it was a period of massive self-reflection for the church when all of these scandals, and the violence and abuse of the Magdalene laundries and the orphanages, and then the paedophile scandals. So yeah, I suppose my mother's attitude, initially my mother didn't like it. My mother's at 85 now, she'd be devout Catholic. But she also saw the funny side, and it didn't stop her going to mass or saying her prayers, because ultimately it's about the message, it's not the messenger. For many Catholics, there was no issue with the message. It was the messengers that were the problem. So I think it's probably mixed,
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this intriguing talk. I really liked it, enjoyed myself. One question to connect to one of the points you had on the slide, that was that they spare out the troubles, which I can completely understand because they were, well, in the middle of the troubles, basically, and the Good Friday Agreement was far away. But if you have a look, for instance, at the Dairy Girls, show with this series, I particularly like it how they deal with the troubles because it's kind of set in the background. Yeah. So maybe can you comment on this?
Yeah, I suppose, and I watched Dairy Girls, and funny, I also 3 or 4 students from the Saarland come over and do their study abroad program with me, and I'll always say that I say it to American students, and I say it to my friends when I come up. The Derry accent is quite difficult. You know what I mean? Like, my best friend from college, he's retired now. He'd be in his early 70s. Is a Derry man. My wife, who knows him for 30 years. Sometimes if he went to the toilet, she'd say to me, what did he say there? Because, he talks fast. There's a lot of Scots in his accent, so it's couldn't, cadn't, wouldn't, whens. So she wouldn't necessarily fret other friends. So I would always warn my German students, look, if you don't understand people, don't worry, because it's a hard accent. Yeah, and I remember saying this to a couple of the students, last year or the year before, and they says, don't worry, we watch Dairy Girls. So they had a handle on it, right? And I think what's unique about Dairy Girls in a sense is that much ink has been spilled, and many films and documentaries have been shown about the troubles and about conflict and conflict resolution, but you very seldom get a teenage perspective. In a sense, children are in the background. They're there, but nobody ever asks them their opinions, or they certainly don't get to articulate their opinion. So it's unique in that regard, and there is more of the teenage voice coming through about the troubles experience. But I think, by the time that Dairy Girls comes out, the troubles are over. 10, 15 years in Derry. The troubles were over in Derry 10 years before the Good Friday Agreement. So obviously you have the British Army there, and the IRA guy in the car going across, they find him in the boot of the car when they drive across to Donegal. So you have, and then at the end it's quite poignant when Michelle's brother, he had been a prisoner, and some people were ambivalent, obviously there was a massive vote in favour of the agreement on both sides of the border, but there were people, naturally enough, there were people who were not happy with this, who felt that their struggle had been in vain. People who's, I suppose if you read Heaney's The Cure of Troy, the widowed policewoman, the policeman's widow, the hunger striker's father standing at the grave, it's these people have paid a terrible price, and from both perspectives, was it worth paying? So I think that Dairy Girls doesn't go into it in great depth. You know, it's in a sense it's funny, you know, when there's a bomb scare on Craigavon Bridge and the aunt is saying, oh, you know, they just do this, you know, I have a, you know, a tanning appointment in 15 minutes. And, you know, then the niece says to her, yeah, doubtlessly the IRS sat down and planned to basically sabotage your hour on the sunbed. So there's funny, and then when they get caught in the Orange March so I think it's handled well. It's not very, obviously it's a comedy show about teenage, you know, girls. It's not about, you know, it's not an in-depth engagement with 40 years of trauma, but I think she does it well.
Yeah, I think it's a nice introduction maybe to students who are not familiar at all with the troubles, just to get kind of an insight.
No, absolutely.
An idea of what it was.
Absolutely, and it is funny, and Derry's like that, and like I'd maybe be in town and you'd be in the file centre and you'd see Michelle sitting on her hunkers eating a bag of chips, you know, and I'd sort of go, and she'd go like that, and I don't know her, but you know, she, you know, you see them around, like it's a small city, and like it's a brilliant show, and the actors, like them young actors have all gone on to great things, or a lot of them, you know, they've done very well, and yeah, so it's, I think Derry Girls is of its time too. It's 20 years probably after the Good Friday Agreement. Things have settled down. Like the whole thing, you know, when the young group of Catholics and Protestants go to their, you know, and Protestants don't like ABBA and Protestants don't like statues, and you know.
Trying to find similarities, and they don't find anything.
Absolutely, but again, that's funny. And then the you know, the lady who plays the Protestant teacher, and then obviously Sister Michael, and she doesn't like the priest. You know, you know, she has a bit of, but then at the end they drink a glass of whiskey together, and so I think it's a very good introduction to a sort of a youth, to, you know, a teenage perspective, because you don't often get
to identify with.
Yeah, thank you. As you mentioned the priest in Derry Girls, would you say that he's based on Father Trendy?
Definitely, you know, the hair, you know, when he walks in first, and you know, what do you call it? Aaron says, I like his hair, and James says, so do I. and you know, the James, you know, the English kid, and of course he's not English. And when I watch that, and they're saying, you know, use our savages, you know, English, right? 50 years ago, I remember my uncle, and he died a young man too. He spent his life, 6 of my mother's brothers went to England. And I remember I would have been about 6, and he brought his kids over for the summer, and they came to visit us. And my cousin Edward, who would have been about 7 or 8, and we were playing or fighting in the garden, and I called him English, right? And I can still see the pain in my uncle's eyes. He came over and he says, son, don't say that. Because he wasn't English, he was Irish. You know, that child had a Coventry accent. You know, he wore, you know, later when he'd come home, he had the Parker, you know, the sort of, you know, that sort of Coventry look. And he had an English accent, but he was as Irish as me, and he considered himself Irish. So in a sense, that was, and then of course, Dad, the grandfather's disdain for Joe from Dublin, you know, because more or less, you know, you's fed us to the wolves, you's left us behind, you know, free state. And you do have that sort of Curtitionist thing, a bit of, and you have it in Germany between, you know, the Bavarians and whatever, but
and the rest,
and the rest. But it obviously has a bit of an edge to it in the context of Irish partition. But yeah, I think she deals with it very well. She brings up all the themes, but you know, she never loses sight of the fact that it's a comedy show about teenage girls.
Thank you. Are there any questions online?
No, we don't have any.
Then Aileen.
Okay, thanks very much for this interesting, fascinating talk. I have a question about, like, my grandmother was from Roscommon and she emigrated to England in the 30s, and she was a Catholic and she loved Father Ted.
Yes.
That always, like when I was growing up, amused me. And she would go to church on Sunday, but she'd laugh at Father Ted. And I have a question about are there any data about the Irish American community in the States, how they receive Father Ted?
I don't actually know. That's a very good question. I don't know how it was received or whether it was actually shown in America. The guy who wrote it, Graham Lennon, has done he's become the male J.K. Rowling. He's really launched himself he's become a vocal opponent of transgender issues, and whether it's a consequence of that or the fact that the comedy that he's doing now is not funny, but he has really he's really become a polemical opponent of trans issues, and he'd be around the same age as me, and I often wonder, like, why did he, what attracted him, why did he, and like some of the things, what I mean, comparing puberty blockers or whatever to experiments in Nazi death camps. Like, he's really gone over the top, and as a consequence so I imagine that this show will never be, it's still on TV, but I imagine that ultimately that has tarnished his legacy as a writer in the same way as J.K. Rowling. Obviously, I was a bit old for the Harry Potter franchise, but in some ways now J.K. Rowling has become more associated with her oppositions to trans issues than with her at least in some circles. But I don't honestly know what the data is from America. And I did say at the outset, I covered myself, this is out of my comfort zone. I just chose this because I do think it is contemporaneous with a time of massive change. And it does show, like the school that I went to, there was one of these priests, every one of them, like, it could have been, I could have wrote it because there was a priest used to arrive and he had an RS2000, like a racing car. And we loved him because he'd come into the class and he'd light up a cigarette, and he didn't take, he's passed away, but he was a character. And there were many characters like that, and they kind of brightened up your day,
But in the end, they're only human too.
Absolutely. Yeah. And when you're living with them, in a sense, you can see that. My mother and father, obviously the priest would come into the house when we were kids, but you mostly saw him in his robes, and he's engaged in what is the great ritual of, the Eucharist, the Mass. So in a sense, and you're separated by a big marble altar and lots of paraphernalia and incense and all. But we actually saw them as teachers. We saw them as managing the football team, as training us, as trying to keep us in line, and that wasn't easy. I didn't begrudge them looking back, but yeah, we saw them as they were, and in some ways, the priests and religious who did their job, who were kind, who did not abuse, single mothers or innocent or young children, they never had anything to fear. You know what I mean? It was ultimately the bad eggs and the people who protected them, who are in sense are, and we've seen it. You've seen it in Germany. You've seen it in the United States, where paedophile priests were either moved out of the jurisdiction, they were moved to the missions, they were moved to another diocese where they could just carry on as before. So in some ways, the bishops and the administrators hold the greater guilt. You know, they should have been moving these people into penitentiaries or prisons, you know. Yeah.
I hope this is not too personal or anything, but you mentioned that you're not religious, but obviously you were raised Catholic. Would you say that the church scandals played a role in that?
I'd say it did, but I'd say probably my experience in school too. I'm not, you know, I would be spiritual, you know what I mean, and I would, you know, when I'm at home, you know, when my goddaughter or my godson has their communion, you know, I'll put on my suit, I'll go, I'll participate. But in some ways, that's what Catholicism was like. You know what I mean? Irish people prior to the famine, they didn't go to mass every Sunday. They often didn't baptize their children until they were in their, you know, until they were in their teens. But they were religious. You know what I mean? They believed. So, and I don't know, like, I'm not a religious man in that I don't believe in organised religion. Look around the world and you see the damage that it has done. That's my opinion. But I do see the benefit of a religious life, and I admire people who, you know, who are religious. And you know, I have friends who are religious. But no, I don't. I think that my going to school, you know, and seeing these, and one thing you will have noticed from my talk, I admired the clergymen that I encountered growing up, and I can laugh about the funny things they did, like Father Ted. I can admire them for their integrity and for the care that they took of their parishioners and indeed of members of my own family. But yeah, I suppose, yeah, I've kind of moved away from organised religion, but I don't think that it's probably more to do with my schooling than watching Father Ted.
Thank you. I have two more questions. On the back, it's the first one.
You mentioned that post-colonial mindset earlier and how it stopped a lot of people from making fun of themselves, or like shows like this to be possible for a while. Is this mindset still like present in society, like especially with a lot of younger people maybe not thinking of that anymore?
It's probably less prevalent now than it was, but at the same time, yeah, you know, you just look at you know, the Irish government, for example, took a lot of slack for recently recognising a Palestine state. And, you know, like the Israeli embassy closed in Dublin, and they've moved their embassy that, you know, closed because of what they deemed to be, you know, anti-Semitism. But, you know, I would personally take deep offence to that, because for me, you know, there's a British colonial context to the tragedy that is unfolding in the Middle East. You know, the Balfour Declaration, which precipitated the foundation of the State of Israel, the man who gave his name to that bloody Balfour, A.J. Balfour, the Conservative British Prime Minister, played his trade in Ireland in the previous decade. So, you know, I think the Irish do, you know, for example, when the Good Friday Agreement, you know, and the whole controversy around decommissioning IRA weapons, when the Americans came up with a brilliant ruse to circumvent this problem, they set up a decommissioning body, and there was a Canadian general, the Finnish Prime Minister, and the Republican movement insisted on Cyril Ramaphosa from the African National Congress, who's now the president of South Africa, because there is a sense, there is an understanding that when we were kids, like my father would have admired Nelson Mandela, Robert Mugabe, you know, General George Grievous, who led the Greek Cypriots against the British, Gamal Abdel Nasser when he closed the Suez Canal, because it was part of a sort of an end of empire, you know, pan-global struggle. And I think that it is that's probably dissipated now. But nevertheless, if you think of if you think of at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, probably the great two most important pamphlets, you know, produced in Ireland that had major cultural and political impact was Douglas Hyde's Necessity for De-Anglicising Ireland and Padraig Pearse's The Murder Machine. These were written 75 years before, you know, Albert Memmi's The Colonizer and the Colonised, or Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. But these are post-colonial texts. These speak to, you know, the ravages of Anglicisation, you know, culture, self-hatred, you know, that is characteristic of a post-colonial society. So, yeah, I think maybe that third world memory is fading, but I think there are still strains of it there. It emerged with Brexit when, you know, probably, well, it's one of the most stupid, I'm not saying something, one of the most stupid members of a British cabinet in my lifetime was a Suella Braverman or Priti Patel, said that, you know, well, we could starve the Irish into you know, forcing you know, Europe to be more flexible. That was criminally stupid on two scores. Number one, like, Ireland was always the best friend the UK had in Europe. And number two, we feed the United Kingdom. You know, we produce 5 times more food. That obviously it's devastating our ecosystems and destroying our rivers and lakes, but we are producing 5 times more food than we eat. So the idea of a British government starving us, you know, is so, and that really raised the heckles of Irish people, as did the idea that, you know, oh, well, you know, Ireland doesn't matter, let's throw them under the bus, you know. So it's there, it's dormant, but it does come out.
Okay, we reached the end of our time. And thank you so much for your time and for answering all those questions. Yeah, I hope we'll see each other somewhere.
Oh,
sometime.
absolutely. And thanks for your patience.
Thank you for your time.